Heidi, all you.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am going to be presenting on cued speech, expanding your literacy toolbox. My name is Heidi Herbon. I am the teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing at Alexander Graham Bell Montessori School in Wheeling, Illinois, which is in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. I've been a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing for longer than I care to talk about. I am fluent in American Sign Language. I am also fluent in cued American English, which is what we will be talking about today. I am the mother of two boys, both of whom are hearing. Both are learning to sign, and they're both also learning to cue. And above everything else, I am an advocate for equal access to language and successful communication, because above everything else, I think that that's where everything starts for a child. So a little bit about my journey into cueing. If you would have asked me a decade ago if I would be standing here presenting on cued speech, I would have laughed in your face and walked away. I became a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing because I fell in love with sign language. I fell in love with the culture. I fell in love with the idea of working with kids that not everybody necessarily wanted to work with. I went to a four-year program. I went to McMurray College, which unfortunately has since closed its doors. But it was a very intensive four-year deaf and hard of hearing program. And unfortunately, in those 4 years, it only touched on cued speech. We talked about everything. We talked about linguistics. We talked about all of the different signing systems. We talked about deaf culture. When it came to cued speech, it was a 1-hour presentation during one day of the entire 4 years that I was in the school. And so I walked away with a very limited knowledge of what cued speech actually was. And I walked away with a lot of false information, which was unfortunate. My very first teaching position was in the city of Chicago in Chicago Public Schools. And I was actually hired for a cued speech classroom. When I went in for the interview, I said, I am all about anything that the students need. I don't know how to cue. I'm more than happy to learn. I don't even know where to start. They assured me that it would be fine. My total communication approach was a great bridge in the classroom, and that they would provide support to learn the cueing. There was absolutely no support. And so unfortunately, that got pushed to the side, and it became a total communication classroom, being more of a SimCom, where I was using spoken English and American Sign Language support. After a year at Chicago Public Schools, I moved out to the suburbs, and I began working in a therapeutic school for deaf students who also had emotional, behavioral, and psychological issues. And in that school, I used American Sign Language, and I also threw in some Pidgin sign based on the kids that I had to give them as much access to language as possible. During my time at that school, I visited Alexander Graham Bell Montessori School, which is only a couple miles down the road, as part of an observation for working toward my learning behavior specialist endorsement. I watched the cueing in the classroom. I knew that that's what they did. I really didn't understand what was happening, but I saw the active engagement in the kids and wanted to learn a little bit more. Fast forward a few years, and I was looking for a new position. I was getting burned out at the therapeutic school, and I needed a change of pace. And so I applied for a job at Alexander Graham Bell Montessori. I came into the interview and I said the same thing. I said, I'm willing to learn the cueing. I'm interested in it, but I know nothing about it. And they assured me that they would teach me. I asked to see a language sample of some of the kids and was absolutely blown away by the written language of the students that I was going to be working with. I was hired immediately and became one of 2 teachers of the deaf. I was trained in cued speech over the course of the summer program. I had my cue chart in front of me and started working with kids who had been cueing since they were tiny babies. It was intimidating to say the least, but we got through it. They were very patient with me, and I've been cueing ever since. And now I travel, give presentations, conduct workshops, and really have become an advocate not only for cued language, but for general accessible communication. Some of the things I want us to think about before we begin this presentation in regards to deaf and hard of hearing children and language acquisition. About 90% of children who are deaf and hard of hearing are born to hearing parents. Becoming a first-time parent is scary in and of itself, and then finding out that your child is different adds another layer. And that's something as professionals that we need to keep in the back of our head. The critical period for language acquisition is from birth to 5 years. So when new parents find out that they have a deaf or hard of hearing child, they immediately are trying to figure out what the best way to communicate with them is. And if they are not provided with all of the language options from the beginning, they don't have a good start. They don't have enough information to make an educated decision as to what is best for their family. One of the most important things that is crucial to language development is frequent, consistent, accessible communication. I am not here to tell people that cued language or cued speech is the only path to language acquisition, because it's not. I have used it with hearing kids and deaf and hard of hearing children. I've used it differently for individual kids in my classroom. In the exact same classroom, I've used it in different ways and different methods. The most important thing is frequent, consistent, accessible communication. Whether it's sign language, whether it is oral, whether it is pigeon sign, whether it is cued speech, whether it is Spanish or Polish or German, it doesn't matter as long as it is frequent, consistent, and accessible to the child. By the age of 4, children who have frequent, consistent, and accessible communication develop an average receptive vocabulary of 1,200 to 2,000 words or more. That skyrockets over the next 2 years. Some more points to ponder. Sign language and spoken language should be considered complementary strategies for encouraging language development in deaf children. When I was introduced to cued speech, I was told that it was something evil that was trying to wipe out deaf culture. It was trying to replace sign language, and that's simply not true. And the two should be able to work hand in hand. At Illinois School for the Deaf, they do work hand in hand. There is a signing track, there is a cued speech track. Those kids come together, they mingle, they socialize. One is not better than the other. They should be considered complementary strategies based on the child's needs. ASL vocabulary and syntax do not parallel those of printed English. So if we are only using American Sign Language to teach written English, we're using one language to teach another, and we're not doing justice to either language, which is where we see the kids struggle. Children need to have experience with English in order to be able to read and write. Again, it's going back to using one language to teach a second language. What we've seen, unfortunately, over the years is that total communication programs that use simultaneous spoken language and signed language have not successfully improved literacy. And it goes back to you're doing 2 languages at once. You're not keeping ASL in its true linguistic form, and you're not teaching English in its true linguistic form because they can't pair together. They are two separate things. One of the things I really want everybody to think about, there's a lot of research out there, and I know that this is older research, but I think that it's still valuable. Beyond parental attitudes towards congenital and early childhood hearing loss, perhaps the single most important variable in the development is the ability and accessibility of parent-child communication. Parents need to be able to communicate with their children. They are with them 24/7 from day one. And if that communication isn't strong and it's not supported in the home, the language development won't be the same as it is in families where that communication is solid. If you have a set of parents who are fluent in ASL and they are signing to their child from day one, that is strong parent communication. Likewise, if you have parents who are speaking English or speaking another spoken language, and their child is typically developing and have access to that language, that's a strong communication system. The breakdown happens when the communication abilities of the parent and the child don't match. So when we have a parent, a hearing parent who has no concept or knowledge of sign language, and we say, your child is deaf, you should sign with them, we're asking brand new parents to learn an entire new language while trying to process having a new child and trying to figure out the best way to educate their child, knowing that every decision that they make will make an impact in the child's future. So how did cued speech come about? It is not here to replace sign language. Let's just get that out in the open. In 1965, Dr. Cornett, who is a scientist, he is a researcher, he became the vice president of long-range planning at Gallaudet University, which is a deaf university. What he noticed was that students were coming in with lower reading levels than what they should have. And even after 4 years of intensive study, those reading levels did not significantly improve even upon graduation. So they're coming in with low reading levels. They have 4 years of intensive study. Their reading levels aren't going up very much. What's the problem? And what he realized is if once kids get to about 4th or 5th grade, they stop learning how to read and they start reading to learn. If their reading ability is capped out at that 4th or 5th grade level, it's very difficult for them to understand new concepts because they're reading things that they don't understand yet. So what he did was he devoted a third of his time to research and how to improve literacy skills. That was his goal. It was not to replace sign language. It was not to create a new system to take out deaf culture. It was simply to improve literacy skills. He wanted his students to succeed. So he sought a way to develop and visually convey language for reading and writing using one hand and the mouth. He wanted it to be simple. He wanted it to be quick. He wanted it to be fully accessible, knowing that generally speaking, you're not going to have both hands always available for communication. So if you needed both hands to do the system, it wouldn't be successful. You wouldn't be able to multitask. So Dr. Cornett, I envision him because he's a researcher. This is probably not what he did, but this is what I envision when I think of it. He realized if all the phonemes of speech look clearly different from each other on the speaker's mouth, just as they sound different to normal ears, a profoundly deaf child could learn language through vision almost as easily as a normal child learns it from hearing. The problem is English is not fully visible on the lips. So what I envision him doing is taking all of the sounds of English and putting them on Post-it notes and setting up a chart of what he needed to differentiate. So Dr. Cornett's thoughts as he's creating this system. He is assuming that the child has hearing parents, and English should be learned as a spoken language and used in daily communication with the deaf child. He wanted that language to start from day one. He didn't want to have to wait for the parents to learn an entirely new language. From day one, kids should be able to access language from their parents. That doesn't mean that 2-day-old babies are going to speak. Hearing 2-day-old babies don't speak, but they are exposed to language from day one. That's what he wanted. The information that's visible on the mouth has to be a component because he wanted it to be a tool that people use, knowing that people are going to encounter non-cuers out in the community. So if the system paired with lip reading and increased those skills, they would be better off in the long run, regardless of if they had the cueing support or not out in the community. The supporting elements should only contain phonemic and syllabic information and must be produced at the rate of running speech. Again, he wanted it to be quick, concise, and in running time. His goal was to make speech through the air visible on the hands and the mouth. When he set up the system, he had a few requirements. Again, the system must aid in speech and speech reading. Those skills are vital for any child, even more so when not all of the sounds are accessible through the ears. The system needed to be concise and require minimal time to learn by hearing parents. He didn't want a huge lag time of learning the system. He wanted it to be quick and easy and something that was easy to remember. This requirement differentiates it from other systems that we'll talk about, like visual phonics, in a little bit. Again, he wanted it to utilize only one hand. Thinking about babies, thinking about parents at home. Parents are holding the baby, they're making dinner, they're folding laundry, they're driving a car. He didn't want language to have to stop because the parents needed both of their hands. He wanted it to be able to be something that they could do and multitask so that communication didn't have to stop throughout the day for the child. His last requirement was that when it was solely implemented by parents, the system must be feasible for very young, prelingually deaf children to understand. I have worked with students who have started cueing from a very young age, and although they don't necessarily cue back to me, there's been a significant increase in their receptive and expressive vocabulary when they're constantly exposed to the cueing along with spoken English. And again, it has to lift the accuracy of communication. When you think about turning the sound off on your TV and only looking at the mouth movements without the captions and without the sound, very little of English is visible on the lips if you don't know the context. So his system needed to lift that accuracy so that language through the air was visible on the mouth. So what exactly is cued speech? It's a phonemically based mode of communication developed to make spoken language 100% accessible through vision alone. That's it. It's trying to level the playing field between hearing children and deaf and hard of hearing children. What deaf and hard of hearing children are not able to access through their ears, he needed them to be able to access through their eyes in real time, in true spoken language form, not a separate language, today we're talking about cued American English because that's what we use in America. Cued speech also has a system for Spanish, for French, for German. There are over 66 different forms of cued speech based on spoken languages, and they match the phonemes of their spoken language. Cued American English is a closed system that has 8 consonant hand shapes and 4 vowel placements that work together in conjunction with mouth movements to show all of the phonemes of spoken English. Again, this makes it much more concise than visual phonics, which has a separate hand shape and movement for each sound. With cued speech, again, to make it able to keep up with running speech, Dr. Cornett had phonemes broken into consonant vowel pairs. So the hand shape represents the consonant, and that's placed at the vowel location. So for example, the word cat starts with the consonant k, 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 and then you have the vowel a. So you take the k and you put it at the a position. So cat, cat. In visual phonics, you would have to show 3 separate movements, which slows down the speech. By being able to chunk it into consonant vowel pairs, you're able to keep up with running speech and make it flow much more easily. It also helps with learning to blend in reading. So now I'd like to go through a quick overview of the system. This is going to be really quick. This is the entire system. Once we're done with this slide, you will have all of the cueing that you need to know. So the first hand shape, again, the hand shapes represent the consonants. So hand shape 1 is made with 1 finger. And when you're cueing, you want to be right over in this area so that, again, the focus can be on the mouth. If you're too far away from your mouth, it's too distracting and it doesn't help with the lip reading and the mouth movement. So hand shape 1 represents the sounds d, p, and j. Again, they all look different on the mouth, so they can share the same hand shape. This helped Dr. Cornett consolidate his system. Hand shape 2 is 2 fingers, and it represents the sounds k, v, z, and z. Again, my mouth is the thing that is changing. My hand is staying the same, but my mouth is changing to indicate the different sound. Hand shape 3 is 3 fingers, and it represents and r. Hand shape 4, in the Midwest, we typically use it for 2 sounds. It does have a third. It's for b, n, and then the breathy hua. Again, in the Midwest, we don't tend to use that very often, but people in other places of the country do use that, the breathy WH sound. Hand shape 5 represents the sounds t, and if there's a vowel that doesn't have a consonant pair, this is the hand shape that is used. So in a word that starts with it, the I doesn't have a consonant before it, so you would cue it it. The I is at the throat and the t is at the side, it. Hand shape 6 is your thumb and index finger, and it represents o, sh, and w, the hard W sound. Hand shape 7, you add a second finger, and it represents the g, j, and the voiceless th. And hand shape 8 represents the ng, y, and ch sounds. Those are all of the consonant sounds in spoken English. That's it, 8 hand shapes. Those paired in conjunction with the vowel placements are what makes the system. So the mouth placement the hand shape is placed at the corner of the mouth. Again, we don't want to block the mouth. We want to have that completely accessible, but cueing on the corner of the mouth. So this represents E and E and The chin, you're going to touch the tallest finger at the center of your chin, and it represents ah, oo, eh. And then there's another one where we take the R-controlled vowel air. We do the vowel at the chin, and then the R sound on the side, air. The throat, you can touch anywhere from the top of your Adam's apple down to the little soft spot on your chin, and it represents I, a, and the other R-controlled vowel, ear. So I, a, and ear. The fourth placement is the side. What Dr. Cornett realized after working with the system, he needed to add a little bit of movement to get rid of some of the confusion with some of the side vowels. So there's just a little movement in the side down. It's just a tiny, tiny movement just to show the difference. So this represents the vowel the short U sound. The other side vowel is side forward. Again, it's just a tiny movement, but instead of going down, you go forward. And this represents O, and then the two R-controlled vowels, or and R. The last two vowel placements that we have are the diphthongs, where we take two vowels that are kind of smashed together to create a new sound. We have I and ow, and those move from the side to the throat. I, ow. And then the last placement is the chin to throat, and that's oi as in boy, oi, and a as in day. And then the last placement is on the side when there is no vowel left over. So for example, the word cat, the k, is one chunk, and the t is the final chunk, but there's no vowel placement for the t, so it goes off to the side. That's the system. All of these children on the screen are students at our school. All of them have learned to cue. Some of them are deaf, some of them are hearing. We don't expect our children to cue back to us, especially in the beginning. Cued speech is used for receptive purposes, again, to just give them that constant accessible exposure to the sounds of spoken English. So what are the benefits of cued speech? First of all, it makes language 100% accessible through vision alone. Even if children are profoundly deaf and they cannot access the sounds of spoken language, they can see the sounds of spoken language. And there's been research done that the brain paths are created in a similar fashion, whether the information is given auditorily or through the vision. So cued speech gives them that full access of language, of the sounds of spoken language, through vision alone. Second, it helps with reading. It provides visual access to phonemes to build phonemic awareness. In order to create strong literacy skills, children need to be able to manipulate the different phonemes and play with phonemic awareness. Speech reading. It disambiguates the lip movements and removes confusion. Things that look the same on the mouth look different on the hands. Things that look the same on the hands look different on the mouth. So even though it's a very consolidated set and a very consolidated system, you can disambiguate all of the sounds of English because everything looks different. Audition for students who do have some residual hearing or do have access to sound through assistive technology. It can validate what's being heard. They hear the sound through their equipment, and then they see the sound through the cueing, and it validates that they actually did hear what they thought they heard. Finally, cued speech can reinforce speech skills. Speech is not required for cued speech. Kids are not forced to talk. You are not forced to have your voice on at all. You are required to move your mouth, but no sound has to come out. So again, only 30 to 35% of English is visible on the mouth. So without the hand shapes and the movements of cued speech, if we only give kids the mouth movements, we're only giving them about 35% of the information and asking them to figure out the rest. So here are two examples of two of my students, and they're going to cue 3 different words. If I cue them or say them without sound, watch my mouth. I did not say them in the same order that is on the screen, but you can't tell the difference because they look exactly the same. With the cueing, the first hand shape shows the difference between mat, bat, and pat. With the second example, the first part of the word looks the same. It's the ending that changes. So again, if I turn off my voice and say them in a different order, they all look the same on the mouth. When I add the cueing, so lip, limb, lib, that final sound is what changes. So some of the benefits of including cued language. Again, this is not a one size fits all. It's not going to fit for every family, but for those that it does work with, it enables them to communicate using the spoken language of the home, whether it is English or Spanish or German. Again, there are several different cued speech systems that match with various spoken languages. So parents who speak mainly Spanish at home are able to cue the sounds of Spanish to their child. They can still share their home language, and that strengthens the communication bond between the parents and the child. The parents are not expected to learn an entirely new language and keep it in its true and pure form from the beginning. They can use the language of the home and then introduce the language later. Again, cued speech isn't meant to replace American Sign Language. Dr. Cornett's rationale was he wanted cued speech for literacy to access spoken English. He wanted them to continue to learn ASL for the cultural component and the social aspect of it. There is a place for both systems at the same time. Cueing is a lot easier to learn than American Sign Language. I've been signing for 25 years, and I'm still learning new signs. Cueing is a closed system. Once you learn the 8 hand shapes and the 4 placements, it's a matter of practicing before you become fluent. It's how much effort you put into it, how quickly you will see the outcome. It enables the child to develop age-appropriate language and literacy skills. Again, we give them the building blocks of the sounds of spoken English through vision. So they have that fully accessible language that they can play with and manipulate and mess around with just the same as their hearing peers. I always tell people I'm not trying to replace anything. I'm trying to even the playing field. I have hearing students that can access everything that I say by listening. I have deaf and hard of hearing students that need that visual component to get that same access. That's what I provide with the cued language. It increases the benefits that a child receives from a cochlear implant or hearing aid if they're aided. Again, it gives them that reinforcement of the sounds that they're hearing through their equipment. Did I hear a sh or a s? Oh, I know, because I can see the hand shape. It allows the child to experience English with full visual access and lay the foundation for language acquisition. We're not giving them parts of a language. We're giving them the full language. So I've had a lot of people ask me, what's the difference between cued speech and visual phonics? My school already uses visual phonics. What's the big difference? Visual phonics is wonderful. I went to a training, I'm trained in it. I've used it with a couple of students, but there are limitations to it. There are definite benefits, but there are also limitations. Cued speech is a communication system. Visual phonics is an instructional tool. Cued speech is used in conjunction with spoken language, whether it is voiced or unvoiced. Again, you don't have to make sound with cued speech, but you do have to move your mouth. Visual phonics was designed to supplement speech and speech reading. In cued speech, this is probably one of the biggest differences. There are 8 hand shapes and 4 placements to signify the vowels. Visual phonics has 44 different movements, but it also provides articulation features for individual phonemes. Cued speech does not provide any kind of articulation information. Cued speech is one system to represent sublexical, lexical, semantic, and syntactic information. Visual phonics only has the sublexical and lexical representations. The other big difference between the two is cued speech represents language at a conversational rate. With the blending of the cueing, I can keep up with what I'm saying and cueing at the same time. If I tried to do that with visual phonics, there are too many movements. I'm a very fast talker. There's no way I can make my hands move fast enough to keep up with the rate of speech and accurately give all of the information to my students using visual phonics. Visual phonics uses spoken English or signed English to convey the required semantic and syntactic information. So again, it's used in conjunction with something else, whereas cueing is something that stands alone. Visual phonics is wonderful for articulation and isolated phonemes, and even up to the word level. Once you get past that word level, maybe even very simple sentence, you can't keep up with running speech. And so if you try to give them all of that visual information at the same time as you're talking, you're not giving them a true auditory experience either, because you are slowing your speech down so that your hands can keep up. Whereas with the cueing, you don't have to do that. I might slow down a little bit because, again, I'm a very fast talker, but I can keep up with what I'm saying when I'm cueing. So some things to think about with English vocabulary and why it is so important to have that strong phonemic base. There are about 250,000 words in a standard unabridged English dictionary. 50 to 75,000 of those are considered basic words, and the rest are inflections or variations of basic words. The receptive vocabulary of an average 6-year-old hearing child is about 25,000 words. So again, between the ages of 4 and 6, we see that language absolutely skyrocket. There are an estimated 5,000 commonly used signs in ASL. That's not to say that ASL is not a full language and it's not as rich as English. ASL has the beautiful ability to use a sign for more than one meaning based on the context. I'm not trying to compare one has more words than the other. I'm simply saying we have a lot of English words that share signs. And so to give children all of the exposure to all of those words, we would have to fingerspell or use other ways to show all of those different forms of that same word in English when it's only represented by one or two signs in sign language. Likewise, there are words in sign language that have 7 or 8 different signs for the same word based on the context of the conversation. ASL is its separate language with its own syntax and sentence structure. We can't take true American Sign Language and use it as the same time as spoken English because you're merging 2 languages together. You're not giving an accurate representation of either language. There is no written form of ASL. So when we only teach ASL to children and then we give them English in print, we have to make a bridge somehow. That's where systems like visual phonics come in. We're trying to bridge that gap between the language that we're using for expressive communication and the language we're asking the children to use for written communication. ASL cannot be used to convey English in its true form, and English can't be used to convey ASL in its true form. They are 2 separate languages. It's like taking French and trying to use that to teach Portuguese. They're 2 separate languages. They have some commonalities, they have some similarities, but they're 2 separate things and they should be treated as such. So here's an example of different signing systems for the same sentence. I am going to the store is the sentence that is in print. If we use signed exact English, it would be I am going to the store. So that's one way. With pigeon signed English, I go to store. We're getting closer. American Sign Language, the vocabulary and the syntax is flipped. Store, go, I. With cute American English, I am going to the store. So I can give all of the information that I am saying with my hands in the same time as running speech. I am not missing words. I am not missing sounds. I am conveying the whole message using my hands. So let's back it up with some research. This is one of my students. She is now 6. She is going to be graduating from her kindergarten program and going back to district. When she came to us, she had no knowledge of cued speech. She now sometimes cues expressively, but usually just uses it for receptive communication. She also uses it to reinforce what she hears to make sure that she's not missing any information. So Mark Marschark, 20 years ago, did some research on language development in children who are deaf. And he was actually out to prove that cued speech was not a great thing. And what he did was he actually proved the opposite. So it's an overview of the research on language development and summarizes many issues related to language development. He also highlights what deaf and hard of hearing children need in order to successfully develop language. So what he found was that early interactions established the foundation upon which language develops. Again, this goes back to parent-child communication. It starts in the home. It doesn't start when they come to EI. It doesn't start when they come to preschool or kindergarten. It starts day one with mom and dad and sister and brother and grandma and grandpa and whoever talking to the child. Those early interactions and those early relationships are what build the foundation for language. Communication is far more accessible to children who share the same hearing status and language as their parents because the natural language models and appropriate communication strategies. Again, if you are a hearing parent and you have a hearing child, you have the same hearing status and language. So it's very easy to communicate. When it's different, you have to figure out what they're hearing, what they're not hearing. How do you bridge that gap? How do you communicate that gap? Do you learn sign language? Do you learn true American Sign Language? Do you learn signed English? Do you learn cued speech? What path is going to work to develop that appropriate language model in a very natural way? Children often acquire sign language at a faster rate than their hearing parents learning to sign due to greater exposure outside of the home and the necessity for efficient communication. So if you have a deaf child who relies on sign language to learn and understand what is going on, they're going to pick it up a lot faster because they need to have it. Parents are very busy. We tend to be overwhelmed. We don't necessarily learn as quickly as children. I can tell you my kids come home with information that I have never learned in my life, and they're 4 and 8 years old. Kids just pick things up faster. And so the problem comes in when the children's ability surpasses the adult's ability to communicate, that language falters and it breaks down. Sign language and spoken language should be considered complementary strategies. Again, one is not better than the other. It is what provides natural and effective and accessible communication. Whether it is signing or English or Spanish, it doesn't matter. It just needs to be consistent, effective, natural, and accessible. If specific efforts are made to ensure consistent access to effective communication and language models, it's possible for young deaf children to develop language at the same rate as a hearing child. Again, language acquisition doesn't have to do with what they are hearing or not hearing. It's what they're able to access. And the problem comes in when they can't access it because of what they're hearing or not hearing. If we give them that access a different way, they can develop language at the same rate as a hearing child. The most important factor for language development in children who are deaf is the ability to communicate with their parents. Working in the therapeutic school, I sat at IEP tables with 17 and 18-year-olds who couldn't talk to their parents, whose parents didn't know how to communicate with their children. And it absolutely broke my heart because that builds up anger, that builds up resentment. You need to be able to communicate with your child. And as professionals, if we can give them those tools, we need to. We need to educate ourselves so that we can educate other people. Again, I never thought I would be talking about cued speech. I never thought I would be presenting on it. But it works. It works for some kids. It's not going to work for everybody. It's not the end all be all, but it is something that I think everybody should be at least aware of if they come across a family that needs it. One of the quotes from Marschark's research is that schools should make use of all possible strategies to encourage reading during childhood in order to promote natural acquisition of language and English literacy among deaf children. There is no one single way to access language. As schools and as professionals, we should be using everything. Throw everything at the kids and see what sticks. We shouldn't expect to find any single predictor of reading success that works for all children. No two children are going to be the same. There is no one size fits all. So it's our job to be as educated as possible so that we can hand those tools out to the family. So there's some other research out there about cued speech and some of the benefits. And one of the research articles out there is the rhyme generation of deaf students. So they took a group of students who were signing and a group of students who were oral, and students who were cueing, and students who were hearing, and they were asked to generate rhymes for 54 words. And what they found was that the students who had been exposed to cued language performed similarly to hearing peers. Participants who also used cued speech seemed to rely more on the phonology of the rhyme generation, while those who did not seemed to rely more on the orthography. So when they were exposed to the cued speech, they were able to play with those sounds and manipulate the sounds, whereas if they weren't exposed to the cued speech, they were relying more on the print. What looks the same, well, that should sound the same. So some other research based on the effectiveness of cueing, cued speech on rhyming, remembering, and spelling. Deaf children with early exposure to cued speech had spelling skills similar to hearing peers in rhyming, memory, reading, spelling. And some of the deaf cueing pre-readers had better rhyming skills than hearing pre-readers, because in cueing, when something rhymes, it ends the same, so the movement is the same. So cat, hat, bat, mat, pat, sat, rat. They all move the same. And so kids who had that early exposure were able to recognize those patterns and pick them up, even if they couldn't access all of the sounds through hearing. So there are 5 key components to effective reading instruction. Phonemic awareness, which is breaking the words down into phonemes. Phonics, which is recognizing that letters represent phonemes and then they blend together to represent the written word. Fluency, recognizing the words easily with greater speed, accuracy, expression, and understanding, and also being able to blend those sounds together. Vocabulary, teaching new words in either text or teaching them separately in isolation to build that strong language base. And comprehension, understanding what is read to make connections. All 5 of these are supported through cued speech. Having that access to the visual component of spoken English allows them to have all of these 5 strategies. So let's look at some common myths about cued speech. Probably the most popular one out there is that cued speech was developed to replace ASL. This is what I was told. This is what several of my classmates were told. This is what I hear all the time from professionals when I talk about working at a school that uses cued speech. Oh, well, you don't use sign language. I use both, and I've used both in the classroom here at the school. In fact, a lot of my older students, now that they know cued speech, really want to learn ASL, and so we teach it as an entire class. Whether you're hearing or deaf, everybody learns cued speech. Everybody's learning American Sign Language. The fact is that cued speech was developed for literacy. Dr. Cornett simply wanted to level the playing field and give deaf students the same access to spoken English as their hearing peers. It makes the sounds of spoken language traveling through the air visible through vision alone. He always, always, always wanted ASL to be a part of the deaf community. He understood that deaf component. He understood the connection with the community and the culture, and American Sign Language is beautiful. Nobody wants to take that away. In fact, many adult cuers are also fluent in American Sign Language. They use the cueing to access the English. So they are truly bilingual. Another common myth is that cued speech equals speech. I said it at the beginning, I'll say it again. I think it was mislabeled at the very beginning. And I wish they would have used cued language from the very beginning, because that's what it is. You don't have to speak. You do have to move your mouth, but even in the community of adult cuers, because the system is so internalized in their brains, they're able to cue without moving their mouth. They call it cue whispering. And because that pattern is so ingrained in them, they can still make sense of it without the mouth movement. Cued language equals phonemes. The cueing represents the phonemes, which are the building blocks of spoken language. Again, cuers must move their mouth to correlate the movements, but the sound is not required. It does not give any placement or production information. It does support phonemic awareness and phonics skills, and it can support speech skills, but it doesn't have to. You're able to use the visual of the cueing for things like minimal pairs. If you have kids that are really struggling with minimal pairs, you can use the cueing to disambiguate that, but they don't have to speak with the cueing. And again, they don't have to even cue back, especially in young children. In my classroom, I don't expect them to cue back to me. I want them to communicate back, whether they choose to cue or speak or sign, it doesn't matter. I'm building that communication base. Another common myth is that you can't cue to babies. I don't know why that would be a thing. You absolutely can cue to babies, and that's the perfect time for parents to learn. When babies are tiny, if you're practicing your cueing and you make a mistake, it's okay. If parents are able to start at the beginning, by the time their kids get to word and sentence level, they will have the system internalized and they can keep that running speech going from day one. Even if parents start later, you can learn the system in a weekend. And then it's up to you to practice it to become more fluent. But the system is closed, it is finite, it is very simple to understand the rules. It's just a matter of implementing it. Cueing allows and maximizes the opportunity for strong language development. It allows the kids to be immersed in visual sound. It builds muscle memory in the parents. You can cue babble. Ma, 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 ma. You can do all of those things and play with sounds just the way that we do through the air with our hands. It also encourages natural and accessible communication between hearing parents and deaf children. Again, the parents can use the language from the home. They don't have to learn an entirely new language in order to create a language experience for their children. Another myth is that if you cue, a child won't listen. In fact, cued language enables children to learn how to listen. Walking into the classroom, our school has a very small population of deaf children, and we are a reverse mainstream. So our deaf children are in the typically developing classroom, but all of the supports needed for that child are provided to the entire class. So when I go in there and I go in and start cueing, usually I will have a horde of small children looking at me and watching and trying to mimic what I'm doing. I have kids on a daily basis come up to me and do this. Hi, Miss Heidi, I'm cueing just like you. And although they're not doing the system correctly, they are watching. The movement of the hands and the movement around the mouth encourages them and engages them into watching and learning and copying. It's a multimodal kinesthetic way of getting those sounds and that phonemic base ingrained in their brain. It also validates what's being heard. When my kids are listening to me and they think they missed something, they'll look back to find the cueing. They realize, oh, I missed that. I need the visual component because I didn't understand it. It gives a visual target for auditory training. And because it gives such a strong language base, it fills in the gaps of misheard information. Kids who are watching the cueing, if they miss something, or they look down to write on their paper and they look back up, they can realize when they've missed something because they have that visual component. So how do we start? How do we get the ball rolling? You can imitate babbling. You can take the sheet with all of the hand shapes and all of the placements and just start playing with the sounds. Da, 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 da. Ooh, oh no. It's very simple to just come up with sounds and just practice the hand shapes and the movements. You can use it to support vocabulary development. If kids are trying to sound out words and they're getting stuck, provide the cueing for each individual phoneme to validate what they're hearing and help them blend those larger words together. You can cue environmental sounds. You can cue the birds chirping. You can cue the doorbell ringing. You can cue the vacuum. Anything that makes a sound, you can cue it to the child so they still have that access. They can identify that sound. You can cue animal sounds. You can cue silly songs. You can make up rhymes. You can go around the table and see how many times you can use the same hand shape to create different sounds. Rhyming words, Dr. Seuss, word families, books, all of those repetitive targeted sound practice. If a kid is specifically targeting the s sound or the k sound, find words with that sound in it and highlight just that sound. Targeting omissions, substitutions, minimal pairs. Again, if they're just missing one sound or they're having trouble with a couple of things, show them the visual. You don't have to cue every single thing in order to utilize cued speech. I have teachers in school that are cueing only during phonics time. They're cueing only during presentations where they present sounds to the kids, or they target a word, or they target numbers during math. They're not cueing everything, and that's okay. You don't have to. As long as it's getting the information to the child. Again, I'm trying to give this as a tool for your toolbox. Will cued speech work for everybody under the sun? No, it won't. But might it help in a specific situation? Absolutely. I wish I would have known the truth about cueing when I started teaching, because I think back to all of the kids who were struggling that I could have helped by simply giving them a cue or giving them that little extra push to help them understand what they were missing. So now let's look at cued speech and American Sign Language as a bilingual approach. In families where the primary language is spoken language, use cued spoken language from the time of identification of hearing level to communicate with the deaf child and enable the child to learn the language of home. Again, we want to build that strong parent-child communication from the very beginning. And cued speech, because it is such a finite closed system, is a very easy and natural bridge to help build that communication at home. Once they have that strong communication base at home and they have that natural language model, then add in the ASL at school or at home. As you're learning, then you can provide that as an addition. You want to give your child as many opportunities as possible to socialize with people all over, whether they're deaf, hearing, whatever. The goal for our children should be that they should be able to communicate with everyone. So start with the natural language at home and then add in the ASL piece. On the other side of the spectrum, if we have a family where the primary language is American Sign Language, then absolutely use American Sign Language to build that strong communication between the parent and the child. That's the natural language. Use that. Don't push it aside. Don't try to replace it. Use that for the natural language, but then add in the English as facilitated by cued speech when it's time for the child to be ready to read, to bring in that English piece, that printed piece. Again, we want strong language from the very beginning. That's the goal. So another key component in this journey is trying to support and empower families, right? Cued speech isn't going to be for everybody, but I do think that it's something that everybody should know about. They should have the choice to choose whether it's an appropriate solution or not. Maybe try it out, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But if they don't know about it, they can't learn about it. In doing these presentations and talking to people, I've realized that I use a lot of words that can be really scary on the other end. Parents hear they're diagnosed, or hearing loss, or communication options, or intervention. There's something wrong with my child. I have to fix it, and I have to pick. If I have an option, I have to pick one. You don't have to pick one. Instead of saying that the child is diagnosed, say that they're identified. It's part of who they are. There's nothing wrong with them. That's just who they are. Instead of hearing loss, hearing level or hearing status. Instead of communication option, use communication opportunities. Children can use more than one. They can cue and sign and speak and do all of those at the same time, and that's okay. Options makes it sound like you have to pick one and you have to stick with it forever, and that's scary. By saying opportunities, you give the parents the power to realize we can try something, and if it doesn't work, it's okay. We can choose something different. Early involvement instead of intervention. We don't want to fix the children. We want to involve them. We want to envelop them into the family, into the society, into their world. We want to get them involved. So again, ways to empower families, knowledge is power. By keeping ourselves informed as professionals, we can make sure that our families are informed. If we don't know something is out there, we can't share that with our families. Don't be afraid to look or think outside of the box. There is no one right way to educate a child. People have been debating it and arguing it for years, and nobody has come to the one way that works for everybody. So if something isn't working, switch it up. Think about what the need is and address the need, and instead of trying to put the child in the box. Don't allow your personal bias to impact the services to a family. I'm guilty of this. When I started in my first school, I should have gone out and been more proactive about learning what cued speech really was, and I didn't. And that's on me. We can't allow ourselves and our thoughts to impact the choices of the families because we're not in that home. The system that a family chooses to communicate with their child has to work for the child, and it has to work for the family. And if that path works for the family and the child as a whole right now, then that's the right path for right now. And that doesn't mean that that's not going to change. It could change tomorrow. It could change next week. It could change in 5 years. But it needs to work for the family. Remind families that it's okay to incorporate more than one approach. There is no one way, especially when kids are little. Try everything. Some things will work, some things won't, and that's okay. So some additional resources. You can contact us at our school, AGBMS or Alexander Graham Bell Montessori School, AHI, for a follow-up workshop or additional materials at the website. I encourage you to check out the National Cued Speech of America website at www.cuedspeech.org. There's lots of news, resources, and further information about the research supporting cued speech. You can also enroll in Cued College and begin learning Cued English on your own time from the comfort of your own home at www.cuecollege.org. Finally, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to answer questions, provide materials, or offer any support that you may need as you dive more into your cued speech journey. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Heidi, I just want to say thank you so very much for your presentation, because I think many of us had the same response. We had no idea that cued speech was created at Gallaudet. Like, I'm blown away by that little tidbit that was never shared, and had the same experience as you. Like, oh, it was mentioned in my grad program and whatever, but no idea. So thank you so very much for clearing up that myth for us. Does anyone have any questions for Heidi? Okay, well, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to stop our recording.